Thank you everybody for joining our webinar on mapping finance as a key tool for implementing NDCs. Good morning, good evening, wherever people happen to be. My name is Robert O'Sullivan from Winrock International and co-chair of the AFOLU working group, and I'll be moderating today's session. So next slide. So first of all, some of the stuff at the beginning. So a small disclaimer that the LEDS GP does not endorse or recommend specific products or services, and that the information provided in this webinar is featured on the LEDS GP website as one of many best practices, resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the ledsgp.org website within a week of the webinar being broadcast. A couple of initial housekeeping items before we get into the meat of the presentation. The first is how to listen in to the webinar. There's two options. You can either listen in through your computer or you can listen in by telephone. Next slide. Everybody is automatically muted during the presentation to help manage feedback and things like that. But if there are any questions, there is on the right-hand side of the control panel a little drop-down menu for questions. And when you have questions that come up during the webinar, please feel free to add a question to that list there, and they will be posted live for everybody to see, and we will collate them and discuss them in the Q&A session at the end. If there's any technical difficulties that you're having, you can either post a question and then we will address it through the question section and the chat function. But if you're having other kinds of technical difficulties, you can also call go to webinars help desk directly on that number there, 888-259-3826. Okay, so a little bit of introductory comments now that the housekeeping stuff has been taken care of. So who is the LEDS GP? So the LEDS GP is the LEDS global partnership that was founded in 2011 to facilitate peer learning, technical cooperation, and information exchange to help with the formation and implementation of LEDS. The LEDS GP is essentially a platform for networking of peers to bring together different experts to help build the capacity of practitioners and progress LEDS through development through into implementation. The LEDS GP engages leaders from over 300 different institutions across government agencies, technical institutions, international agencies, and NGOs. It operates through a combination of regional platforms. There's a regional platform for Africa, another for Asia, Europe, Eurasia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And there's also 6 cross-cutting technical working groups that cut across each of the different regional platforms. And those cross-cutting technical working groups are on AFOLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, finance, sub-national integration, benefits, transport, and energy. The AFOLU working group is hosting this in collaboration with the finance working group. Part of the focus areas for the AFOLU working group for 2017 include finance and also focusing on Africa and supporting NDC development in Africa. Hence, the topic of this webinar is perfectly aligned within the objectives of both the finance and the AFOLU working group. So why is there a separate working group on AFOLU? I'm sure most people are aware that up to nearly 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the AFOLU sector. But in many lower income countries, AFOLU can account for as much as 80% of national emissions, making it a particularly important sector for many developing countries. And this is recognized by many countries around the world with on average around 80% of NDCs, including some reference to AFOLUs. And this is higher in certain areas, including in sub-Saharan African countries where around 96% of NDCs include some sort of reference to AFOLU. And so that's a little bit of background on the LEDS GP and also the AFOLU working group. But the main objective why everyone has dialed in and participating in this is to hear about the excellent work that we'll be discussing in this webinar. And so the presentations, there'll be 3 presentations. The first will be by Adeline Dontonville from the EU RED facility, which is a program of the EU Forest Initiative. And then we will hear from Angela Faulkner from the Climate Policy Initiative, and then finally from Mark Dawbury from Impactum. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to the experts to discuss some very exciting new work that they've recently released.
Hello everyone, this is Adeline speaking. I will start this presentation by giving you a short introduction to the project. After the Paris Agreement came into force last November, countries are now keen to take action to achieve their NDC objectives. Land use mitigation and adaptation is a key feature of many tropical countries' NDCs. We've seen that many countries have been developing national RED+ strategies to guide the management of land resources in ways consistent with economic growth and emission reductions. Yet the majority of public and private investments are still thought to support business as usual land use activities, and it remains quite complex and challenging for countries and their partners to balance competing development priorities. This is resulting in many cases in uncoordinated and sometimes incoherent use of limited resources. Improving the understanding of land use investments, therefore, is a key step towards effectively planning and implementing NDC commitments. Countries can benefit from taking a critical look at their current spendings to realizing efficiencies, as well as making the case for accessing new sources of finance, such as the Green Climate Fund. These issues have been at the core of Cote d'Ivoire's climate change and land use policy developments. For those of you who don't know Cote d'Ivoire well, this is a West African country which has lost the majority of its primary forests over the last century. At present, Cote d'Ivoire's forest cover amounts to only about 2% of the territory, and it's estimated that the country could lose its entire forest cover by 2034. To address this rapid loss, the government of Cote d'Ivoire has announced commitments to achieve its growth goals while reducing deforestation, in particular through its NDC commitment of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 28%. In the land use sector, this translates in the commitment to decouple cocoa production, which is one of the main drivers of deforestation in Cote d'Ivoire, from deforestation, from forest cover loss, as well as to restore the forest cover to 20% of the territory by 2030. So these are ambitious commitments, and they're framing the national RED+ strategy as well as the national RED+ investment plan that are currently under development. But the central issue is, do financial means available in Cote d'Ivoire match this ambition? To answer this question, the Ministry of Cote d'Ivoire in charge of environment commissioned a landscape of land use finance. This landscape identifies the nature and the volume of domestic and international public finance that both drives or reduces deforestation pressures in Cote d'Ivoire. And that's for the year 2015. It provides, this landscape provides a baseline against which to measure progress towards the level of investments that are required to implement the national RED+ strategy. And the landscape also identifies opportunities to increase and redirect finance for the implementation of that national REDD+ strategy, which is a core part of the country's NDC. This study was conducted by Climate Policy Initiative and local consultants from the Ivorian NGO Impactum, with the technical and financial support of the European Forest Institute and the UN REDD program, in close partnership with the permanent REDD+ Executive Secretariat of Cote d'Ivoire, the Ministry in charge of the Environment, the Ministry of Budget, and the Ministry of Planning. But beyond these actors, the work was also conducted in a participatory manner in cooperation with multi-stakeholder REDD+ working groups representing all relevant sectors. Let me now detail the methodological approach that was taken, which we've divided into 3 steps. The first step is to define the scope of which financial flows we want to track and come up with a consensual definition for this, which will guide data collection and analysis throughout the exercise. In Cote d'Ivoire, the government was interested in knowing which flows of finance were contributing both positively and negatively to deforestation objectives. The framework that we used was that of the REDD+ strategy. We therefore started by identifying all activities or investments having an impact on forests within the sectors covered by this strategy. So these sectors are, for example, agriculture, energy, environment, forests, mining, planning, etc., across 12 ministries. From there, with the support of the different sectoral working groups, we developed a typology of activities aligned to REDD+ objectives. But we not only wanted to measure the positive investments, but also understand the broader flows of finance which are impacting land users in Cote d'Ivoire. So we also identified business as usual investments that could potentially have led to deforestation. In this sense, this approach is quite innovative compared to previous experiences of mapping climate finance in other countries, because it looks both at the green finance, but also at the gray flows of finance. And in a minute, Angela will illustrate this difference. So once we have defined the scope, the second step is to collect the relevant data. The data that we need to perform this work is both quantitative but also qualitative. Financial data, so quantitative data, is ideally collected from a central source, such as a budgetary information system if it exists in the country, and at the most disaggregated level. In Cote d'Ivoire, we had access to public expenditure data for the year 2015. Our partnership with the Ministry in charge of the Environment, the Ministry of Budget, and the Ministry of Planning was instrumental to ensure access to this data. Off-budget data also had to be collected, but directly from relevant organizations, such as public enterprises or public funds. We also looked at international public finance, and we collected and compiled data from multiple sources in cooperation with donors, which were then submitted a survey to verify and validate their individual data sets. Finally, qualitative information on projects also needed to be collected from relevant ministries and partners, as this is key for data interpretation. The third step is indeed this analysis and interpretation performed through coding of the data. Coding of public expenditure data was done by answering key questions related to our framework and with reference to the study definition, such as whether the activity was aligned to REDD+ objectives, if so, which policies and measures of the REDD strategy were supported by the activity. Was the activity related to mitigation, to adaptation, or rather aiming at improving the enabling environment, etc., etc. So once that data was categorized and verified by data providers and key stakeholders, it was aggregated into a simple Excel database. Multiple cross-checks were done to avoid double counting. Data was then represented visually, as you will see in a minute, to support the communication of the results. And then on this basis, policy recommendations were developed, tailored to the needs of the RED strategy and investment plan. Angela will now take over from me to give you some more detail on the results of this analysis.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Angela Faulkner. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today, and thank you very much for LEDS-GP for hosting us. So let me take you through a couple of the key findings from our study. This is the landscape of RED+ aligned finance in Cote d'Ivoire in 2015. The landscape provides a snapshot picture of financial flows in that year in 2015, showing the life cycle of flows from sources of finance on the left-hand side, the instruments and actors channeling finance in the center here, and the end uses on the right. The width of the flows is representative of their size, of their value. In Cote d'Ivoire, we focused on mapping public, international and domestic flows of relevance for RED+. We used data from 12 ministries in Cote d'Ivoire and over 15 international donors and funds. The overall picture shows decision makers to see. The overall picture allows you to see decision makers, the difference and scale between grey and green flows. But first, let me take you through the green flows here. So on this slide, you can see RED+ aligned activities in green. These activities are those that clearly contribute to reducing deforestation drivers and to enhancing and protecting forest cover, including sustainable forest management and land planning that you can see on the right-hand side here. So for instance, if we look along the top of the chart from left to right, we can see that most funding is channeled through the Treasury as budget expenditure by technical ministries or as grants, which go mostly to enabling environment activities at present, with little going to sustainable agriculture intensification, for example. Overall, we identified $28 million of investment by the Ivorian government and its partners in 2015, which contributed to achieving RED+ objectives. This, though significant, is a small fraction of the expected investment needs to implement the country's national RED+ strategy and NDC objectives. Those needs are still being quantified, but in our study we looked at one particular policy area to get an idea of the potential gap. Estimates suggest that more than $290 million per annum would be needed to meet Cote d'Ivoire's 2030 20% forest cover objective alone. And we found that only about 2% of this, about $6 million went to reforestation and sustainable forest management in 2015. So we can see that also on this diagram that enabling environment spending is higher than direct spending, with just, for example, $750,000 being spent by the Treasury alone, no international donors, on sustainable land use planning. Meanwhile, only $5 million also went to land tenure support in the context of wider programs on addressing land tenure issues across the country. We can therefore see that enabling environments are still underfunded in Cote d'Ivoire, and mainstreaming REDD+ objectives in sectoral spending will require considerable additional investment in the coming years to build up a stronger enabling environment, including focus on land use planning, increasing the support for revising land tenure risk, and building up robust enforcement and measurement systems, as well as capacity building. In this same year, in 2015, as you can see in this figure, we also identified, however, 141 million US dollars of public money in Cote d'Ivoire that was invested in grey business as usual activities. These activities, we define them as agricultural intensification activities, which did not explicitly account for deforestation risks and could even have potentially contributed to deforestation and forest degradation due to lack of strong land use planning and secured land tenure. This shows the need to ensure that sustainable land use objectives are integrated with investment planning in many sectors such as agriculture and energy. So here we have again the overall picture of green and grey flows together. This is a visual tool here, the landscape illustrating a much more complex reality underneath the data set that underlies this figure. On this basis, we can do tailored analysis and draw and inform policy makers and stakeholders. So let me just give you a couple more examples of our key findings to give you a flavour of the study. So in this diagram, you can see how much was spent by Cote d'Ivoire and its partners in 2015 in billions of West African francs. You can see here listed the priority areas identified in Cote d'Ivoire's national REDD+ strategy. The orders of magnitude vary considerably from, for example, agricultural intensification to how much we were able to identify was being spent on other activities like reforestation and sustainable mining. So this here is a zoom in box in the dotted line, so we can actually see those figures. The graph highlights the low level of REDD+ aligned spending by the government of Cote d'Ivoire and its partners in key sectors driving deforestation. In 2015, for example, donors spent 55 times more money on agricultural intensification than in the forest sector on activities like reforestation or sustainable forest management, highlighting the low level of investment in those areas and the need to mainstream climate objectives into land use investments. We found that forest protection is yet to be mainstreamed into national and sectoral development strategies of the government and also the development partners. Secondly, here you can see the difference in spending between the government of Cote d'Ivoire and international partners. This figure aims to really highlight a major opportunity to green existing finance flows and mainstream sustainable land use in investment plans in relevant sectors, in particular in energy and agriculture. As you can see here, both the government of Cote d'Ivoire, their budget, and also the budgets of development partners are not yet explicitly accounting for deforestation risks in their agriculture spending in particular, and some of this spending may have contributed to increasing deforestation or forest degradation due to the lack of strong land use planning. So greening existing flows of finance to the agricultural sector from both domestic budgets and also international partners could really increase the availability of red-aligned finance. We estimated that it could increase by 5 times up to $170 million US. To do this, to green existing flows of finance needs more work on enabling environments, to mainstream those REDD+ objectives in sectoral spending, to address land tenure risk, and involve strong land use planning. So with that flavour of our results, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Marc Dobray, who has been our partner on the ground in Cote d'Ivoire for this work, to talk about lessons learned.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Marc Dobray from Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa. So after the that we have presented the methodology and the key findings, let us go now through the lesson learned and the next steps. For lesson learned, we will first focus on a broad analysis before presenting more specific Cote d'Ivoire-oriented aspects. Some tips and lessons for replication in other countries can be mentioned. First, we think that the scope of work really much depends on the availability and complexity of data sources, access, and structure. Feasibility needs to be assessed on this basis. Public versus private, centralized versus decentralized data, need for data collection, level of detail of data, availability of qualitative information. We also think that definition of scope, what to count, definition of activities, and interpretation needs to be participatory way. So we focused a lot on this participatory approach. Definition can be built on international frameworks, but need to be adapted as much as possible to the national context. Thirdly, political support is essential for data access. Financial data is sensitive, you know, and appropriate institutional arrangements and agreements need to be put in place. For example, in Cote d'Ivoire, we have to acknowledge the role of the Ministry of Budget, who gave us full support for access to data and analysis. This work has some great potential to help government services improve quality of data, finance tracking, coordination, and also help integrate data. For example, today, the Ministry of Economic and Finance is using this tool to map the financial flows in the agricultural sector. But when going to, let's say, a more specific Cote d'Ivoire-oriented approach in terms of lesson learned, we would like to go back to the NDC and the Paris Agreement. As you know, during COP21, Cote d'Ivoire, as many other countries, committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emission by 28% by 2030, mainly focusing on forest, AFOLU, agricultural, forestry, and land use sector to meet its targets and ambitions. This mapping exercise is coming as a tool for NDC implementation, more specifically regarding opportunity for cross-sectoral dialogue, sectors like forestry, agricultural, energy, planning, etc. Even when talking about the private sector and the NGOs, they are also involved. Then climate investment alignment, when we're talking about needs and ambition and also the gaps, we have to focus on that. Benchmarking tool, inspiration from this study is also coming for other climate-related sectors and for the NDC globally in Cote d'Ivoire. And advocacy, beyond the will of the government and the objective, action need to be taken. And ongoing, for example, we have an initiative from international donors based in Cote d'Ivoire to support the government to address the forestry issue as a priority the next steps will mainly focus on ongoing climate and REDD+ related activities in Cote d'Ivoire, also inspired by this study and analysis. Analysis fed directly into the national REDD+ strategy and serves as a benchmark for the investment plan and also as a basis for the Green Climate Fund funding proposal ongoing, and also for private sector engagement. When talking about feeding, we can, for example, note that the National Investment Plan, in its first preliminary assumption, is matching with our study, and the needs is around 200 million euros per year, coming again to the issue of needs and gaps. The ongoing funding proposal for the Green Climate Fund, around $60 million, with a strong private sector co-financing engagement, also of $60 million, in line with the International Cocoa and Forest meeting and declaration last week in London with Prince Charles Sustainability Unit and World Cocoa Foundation. Ongoing private sector engagement also with some multinational companies such as Mondelez International, initiating a very promising and innovative zero deforestation project on the ground. But I think that most of all, inspiration is also for the ongoing NDC roadmap implementation, the work plan and its national investment plan, and more specifically for other climate-relevant sectors such as agricultural, energy, and waste. So on these notes, I will pass the mic to the moderator, Robert Sullivan. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. To me, this is a fantastic piece of work, and it's great to see this innovative type of thinking in visualization, which I'm sure everybody will agree is a great tool to understand how financial flows operate in practice in a country. And so there has been a lot of questions streaming in. I have a number in my head at the moment as well, but I will kick it off with the questions that have been coming in from the audience, because I know there's quite a lot, and I'll combine a couple together. And I think the first question, I'll combine a couple from Juan Chang, essentially on how do we move the gray over into green, and how do we identify financial gaps in the most efficient way to fill these gaps. So I'll turn that over to the panel to maybe have a comment on or a response to that combined question.
So Angela here, maybe I'll say a few words and then pass over to Adeline and Mark to complement. So in terms of greening the existing flows of finance on agricultural intensification, this plays to a lot of the enabling environment activities that need to be implemented to a greater extent to integrate sustainable land use planning into agricultural investment plans. So in Cote d'Ivoire, we see that this is still a process that's in progress, and it's not yet integrated into the agricultural investment plans of the Ministry of Agriculture, and therefore also not integrated into the plans of the development partners. So I think land use planning is a huge element here, as well as some of the innovative approaches that Mark has mentioned on public and private partnerships with large agribusinesses, for example, to integrate sustainable land use approaches into their existing production systems. So there is a huge opportunity there, and which needs very well linked up thinking between different departments and across different development strategies of those ministries, and flowing through to the development partners. I'll hand over to maybe Mark for some further reflections on this.
Yes, thank you, Angela. Yes, you're totally right. I think that landscape planning, sustainable landscape planning is very key, and it will be part of how to dream these REDD+ strategies. The pilot project and most of the projects we're implementing on the ground are focusing on this landscape planning as a kind of prerequisite, but still the government needs to do a lot. They have planned to do it, and now we have to work to get funding for that. But it's very key. Maybe if Adeline want to add something.
Yes, maybe just to add, I think this study and the results of this study is really providing a very good benchmark for the government of Cote d'Ivoire to understand how money is currently being spent. And there's a process ongoing at the moment to come up with the investment plan for REDD+, so to cost the policies and measures that are envisaged for REDD+ implementation. And basically having this benchmark and having the costing of these activities will enable stakeholders to identify where the main gaps are, not only in terms of finance that is missing, but also where finance could be better spent. And also in terms of, so that's in terms of financial terms, let's say, but there's also, as was pointed out by Angela, there's also big gaps in terms of policy. And this is also one of the results of this study, that we've been able, looking at individual spending of given ministries and actors, to understand some of the limitation of sectoral policies and some of the incoherences between sectoral policies and REDD+ objectives. So now there's also a real process starting on the basis of this, led by the Ministry of Planning and the REDD+ Secretariat, on efforts to mainstream REDD+ objectives in the national development planning, as well as in selected sectoral planning, such as agriculture and forests. So I'd say this work has really triggered some interest in that direction, and provides a good basis to launch that kind of work across different sectors.
Thanks. So the questions are coming in thick and fast, but I'll take another couple and try and combine them together. And there's been a couple that have come in around the question of private sector finance and how that has or hasn't been included in the analysis. In particular, some reference to contribution from the cocoa sector and other private companies that have pledged to reduce deforestation from their supply chains. So that's, you know, there are naturally going to be some limitations in this type of study, but if you could speak to a little around the role of private sector, how that has been factored in or not into this work, and also, you know, what else could be done if it's not in there to bring that kind of additional richness of analysis into this type of work. And I think that might be a question, maybe start off with Angela, and then the other team can chime in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rob. So we've been doing similar exercises here in Climate Policy Initiative for the past 5 or 6 years in our global landscape of climate finance. And then in Indonesia at the national level a couple of years ago across all sectors. And this was our first look specifically into the land use sector in Cote d'Ivoire. So it's the first landscape, the first exercise to look into public budgets in Cote d'Ivoire. So it was quite a challenge, and we were on quite a short time scale. We decided quite early on to focus initially on the public side, on domestic and international data, due to the limited availability of private data, and also we had enough of a challenge on the public side to begin with, but we do hope that it will be possible to expand over to the private side in the future to gather more consistent and complete data on that side. However, we did during this study gather some pieces of information on the private landscape and important private players qualitatively or as sort of sample pieces that we weren't able to capture and aggregate with the other data due to data inconsistency or lesser quality of data. But what we did find is that private or quasi-public industry associations really play a key role in influencing Cote d'Ivoire's agribusinesses and agricultural investments through infrastructure investment support and also provision of subsidies to producers. There's very little data, however, on that level of support or nature of support, so it's more anecdotal at this stage. But we think that the filiae, the industry associations for the major crops like cocoa and rubber, are playing a major financing role, and so it will be very important for Cote d'Ivoire to work with them closely in the coming years to work on redirecting those investments. You can find a little bit more information on that in our report, as well as some more sort of experimental estimates of the role of large agribusiness using data sources like the Bloomberg terminal. But it's early stage, so we weren't able to include it with the other flows in this landscape yet.
Okay, thanks. Do any of the other panel want to chime in on that? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question. I will move on. So we've talked about the private sector and the role of that, and also how we shift the grey to the green in terms of financial flows. But another observation that one of the participants of the webinar noticed is that looking at the funding landscape, it looks like most of the funding has gone through national governments rather than through local governments. And I was wondering if the panel could comment on why this might be the case in Cote d'Ivoire, and if there's any mechanisms within RED that might help channel some of that to local governments. And that might be a question for Mark or Angela to comment on.
Yes, Angela, do you want to start?
Maybe I can just say what we found from the data, and then Mark, I think you can give a lot more
yes.
context.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it does seem that there's a very little budget being channeled to local governments, so there's a huge opportunity for local governments to play a greater role if increasing finances is made available. And there's a lot of mechanisms that could be used to do that, but at the moment the data that we had suggests that state budget transfers to the local level play a really minor role in land use in Cote d'Ivoire. Mark?
Yes, I think that you're totally right. The thing is that in Cote d'Ivoire, local governments are only starting now to develop their own local strategies. So we talked about sustainable landscape planning, which was key and a kind of prerequisite to move and shift from gray to green. And it has to be done also with the local governments, because when talking about landscape, local governments are very key in implementing this planning. I think that we are in a kind of starting point. Things are moving. We talked about the private sector, and it's also the same thing for the local government. Things are moving now. Things are starting. There is a lot of awareness and commitment from the local government, but now things are being put in place. For the figures, they haven't yet been identified fully as recipients of the funds from international donors, for example. But all this is coming to be established and coming to move forward. Adeline, do you want to add anything?
I might add a follow-up question to that from the audience, and this is more digging into some of the domestic organizational governance side of things in Cote d'Ivoire, but which government agency is responsible to ensure some of the coordination across sectors for these different financial flows? That might be a question for Mark to also respond to.
Yes, we have the organization in Cote d'Ivoire. When we're talking about all the sectors, all the economy, so it's the Ministry of Budget, and within the Ministry of Budget, you have the specific department that we worked with, called la Direction du Budget. Which is tracking and which is also overviewing all these flows. But as talking about the forest sector, we have now the Red Plus Secretariat, which has been established to be a kind of multi and cross-sectoral unit based within the Ministry of Environment, but also working closely with all the relevant ministries.
Okay, great, thanks. Now, moving up, we've been talking about focusing on Cote d'Ivoire and how that might how the financial flows work on the ground there. But moving up to looking at the donor landscape, what does this research and analysis and findings mean for donors and others looking at RED and other AFOLU financing for Cote d'Ivoire? What should they take away from this work? And I guess that could be a question for the whole panel.
So Bob, I think this study has revealed some very interesting findings about donor funding. First, to start with, that donor funding is very important in the land use sector, so that it's a key partner of the Ivorian government to implement land use policies. And also very positively that we found that most donor funding, or large share of donor funding, is being channeled through the government and through the ministry's instruments. So we can believe that there's quite a good alignment between government policies and priorities and donor funding. Yet, on the other hand, we also discovered that a large share of donor funding is actually not aligned to REDD+ priorities.
We might be having some connection issues there.
Can you hear me?
It seems to be okay, I think.
Okay, I will just go on. So we also found out that a large share, more than 80% of donor funding, was dedicated to activities that might lead to deforestation. So that is quite surprising, obviously, because you would think that that donors have the environment and forest risk at the core also of their interventions, but really there's a difference still between international commitments and the actual alignment of policies and donor support in Cote d'Ivoire. So really, these findings are I think a key tool for donors to be able to reflect on the impact of their investments, also as an advocacy tool to ignite a discussion with the central government on policy priorities and how to improve the efficiency of finance and aligned support to the REDD+ and NDC objectives of the country. So we're really hoping that this is a good basis for that discussion, which actually has already started in the forest sector, for example, to look at how donor can improve support to the forest sector, which, as you've seen in the results, is largely underfunded, and support government policies in a more efficient way.
Great, thanks. I guess we're coming up to the end of the hour, and so we should probably move towards wrapping up. I guess one last opportunity for last reflections or comments from any of the speakers we've had today. Otherwise, I'll move on. So on this last slide that you can see, there is more information that is available on the study. There's a nice executive summary that's nicely done on 2 pages, as well as a much longer report that gets into a lot of the details. So I guess thank you everybody for listening in today for the hour, and also for our excellent panel for sharing this important piece of work. And finally, for a last plug for the LEDS GP, if you have an interest in learning more about LEDS GP and some of the work through the different working groups, please go to the LEDS GP website. The AFOLU working group and the finance working group certainly welcome your interest and participation, and we welcome you to join either or both of the working groups to continue these kinds of collaborations and discussions and learning going forward. So with that, I would like to again thank everybody for attending and for participating in this webinar, and I will now close the webinar. Thank you again, everybody.